It's 1985. Yes, I'm being hyperbolic with the video. I'm 11 years old, and Hasbro's Transformers had properly embedded itself as the definitive toy of my youth. I was on a robot craze, and I was walking through the local comic store. A little title came to my attention. It was called Robotech, a title that generated a memory, as I had been transfixed on a series of robot models of the same name by Revell some time prior. At $2.25 was more expensive than the Marvels I had been acquiring, but I managed to convince my father to pick up 2 issues. It was Robotech Masters number 5 and the Macross Saga number 5. These very same issues, by the way. At the bottom right there was an indicator, as seen on TV. I was catching the story mid-stride, but I was hooked. Only a few weeks later I discovered the actual show, airing 2 episodes every Saturday morning. I wore out those early VHS tapes, transfixed at this cartoon's mature storytelling and intense action. It would be the start of my fascination with anime in general, a love that has mellowed of late, but never entirely went away. But Robotech's connections outside of its original 85-episode run remains tenuous, with modern-day critics curious if this franchise still has legs. I'll be attempting to cover the entire history of Robotech from its early inception at the dawn of the global robot craze to its recent slew of board games, technically this video's ultimate focus. Sit back, get yourself comfortable. This may take a while. Before I get too much into this, I wanted to give out a pair of shoutouts to YouTube pages Mercury Falcon and Toy Galaxy for filling in the gaps in my timeline. They go into more detailed accounts of both the backstory around Robotech as well as focusing on the various toys released. Despite my introduction in the mid-80s, Robotech actually tracks back to the formation of the notorious Harmony Gold founded by Frank Agrama in 1983. Well, technically I need to go back to Japan in 1982 and the release of Macross. Macross was a watershed event in Japanese animation and is considered one of the pillars on which the medium stands upon today. Although it wasn't the first to blend such contrasting genres, the mix of transformable mecha, mature storylines, romance, and pop music would be considered a staple that would be replicated numerous times for the next 20 years. By this time, numerous Japanese cartoons had already been translated for North American audiences, including Star Blazers and Thunderbirds 2086. And an audience was growing for these animated shows directed at older audiences. This coincided with the explosion of the Japanese robot toy scene, high-quality products that would soon leave an impression on American children. The first to really take advantage of the situation was Hasbro, who in 1982 secured several designs from various sources, most notably Diaclone and Microman, 2 different toy lines featuring transforming robots, one vehicles, the other smaller, everyday objects. In case you were ever curious why Optimus Prime changed into a truck while Megatron turned into a P-38 pistol. There was one noteworthy and infamous exception to these 2 acquisitions, that of the soon-to-be rebranded Jetfire, based on the Valkyrie VF-1 from Macross. It's somewhat shocking that the next sequence of events all occurred between 1984 and 1985. Transformers would be released in 1984, the same year Harmony Gold would finally ink its deal to import and translate Macross. Around that same time, game company FASA had released Battletech with robots licensed from 20th Century Imports, and included designs from Macross, Fang of the Sun Dugram, and Crusher Joe. That's 3 different American companies all employing the same transformable fighter. It would soon become 4 as model company Revell had also secured the rights to many of the same designs. They were rebranded and released under the name Robotech Defenders. Not confusing at all. When original Japanese toy manufacturer Takotoku went out of business in 1984, Bandai purchased much of what remained with plans to continue the Macross franchise in Japan. Harmony Gold still couldn't import these toys thanks to Hasbro, and the latter would later replace Jetfire with Skyfire thanks to the legal issues that rose as a result. Obviously, Harmony Gold held the most legitimate claim as they were importing Macross to North America, but they had a problem. Currently, the title released to America, Space Fortress Macross, was only available via mail order. At 36 episodes, Macross fell well below the 65 minimum required for syndication back then. Inexperienced in the importing of Japanese anime, Gold enlisted the help of a resident expert, an individual that would both be championed and vilified: Carl Macek. It was Macek that convinced Gold to market Macross to young teens rather than children, to translate the source material maintaining its dark and epic narrative. However, a subsequent decision would prove less popular. Fortunately, Harmony Gold had actually licensed several anime titles, and it was decided that 2 unrelated shows would be tacked onto Macross to extend the series. Instead of faithfully translating the titles and releasing them under the umbrella of an anime block, it was decided that Mesa would construct a continuity between all 3 shows, which to stress were unrelated. However, they weren't dissimilar. Macross had sparked a surge of derivative titles, and as such there was a swell of similar shows, including the 2 used for this developing franchise, Superdimensional Cavalry Southern Cross, as well as Genesis Climber Mos Peta. Or Mos Peta, I've heard both pronunciations. All 3 featured transformable vehicles, romantic triangles, and an element of music. Heck, all 3 involved subplots revolving around the wooing of a hot female alien with green hair. As Macross was the most popular and the first, it would lay down the foundation and be the most faithfully translated. A few names were changed, and an unfortunate and unnecessary narration was added to spoon-feed the plot for those still eating paint chips. However, there was still a problem. This new show lacked a name, and to complicate issues, the confusing mess of robot licensing created an environment of muddled branding. Eventually, Revell and Harmony Gold would settle into an agreement, with the latter adopting Revell's brand to their show. And Robotech was born. To assemble his narrative, Macek decided that each show would represent a generation within a larger epic, with later characters being the descendants of prior ones, although this would create issues when trying to explain the sudden jarring shifts in story and character design. In the original Macross, the titular vessel is a rather unimportant warship employed by the virtually nameless enemies of the Zentradi, giant humanoids whose entire culture, or lack thereof, revolves around the perfection of war. The Zentradi suspect the smaller humans as being a protoculture, one that predates them, and as such is a threat, as exposure to protoculture can result in Zentradi losing their desire to fight. Which they eventually do, leading to a mass rebellion and a civil conflict between Zentradi allied with humans and those wishing their annihilation. Ultimately, humans are victorious, with the survivors of both species left to rebuild the planet Earth that had unfortunately been destroyed in the Crossfire. In the original Southern Cross, humans have colonized the distant planet of Glory in the Epsilon Eridani star system, and the namesake military protects the civilians when the original inhabitants, the Zor, arrive to reclaim their world, vital to their survival as they possess a symbiotic relationship with the Protozor, a native flower now only growing under the 3 strange mounds conveniently located outside the sole human colony. During the course of the war, the Zor capture and brainwash a human pilot, Siegfried Weiss, who becomes an ace pilot against humanity. He is liberated, but becomes conflicted between his original memories and his conditioning, resulting in near insanity but an eventual refocus to take revenge on the Zor for what they have done. Which he does. The series was cancelled, so it basically ends with that. In the original Mos Peta, in the distant future, an alien force called the Invid, or Inbit depending on your preference, decimates Earth, leaving sporadic survivors to subsist the best they can. To reclaim the planet, military expeditions launched from Mars attempt to take out the Invid base, known as Reflex Point, though each suffers failure. In the latest, one survivor makes it to the surface and forms a resistance group with local bands and soldiers in an attempt to succeed where thousands had previously failed. This is complicated by the Inbit's capacity to detect the hydrogen-based fuel system known as HBT, which basically powers all of humanity's technology in the future. Upon reaching Reflex Point, the heroes discover the Inbit had originally arrived in order to advance their own evolution, and upon realizing both species are on the brink of extinction, the Inbit ruler is convinced to basically just leave. In Robotech, Zor was an ancient scientist that discovered the flower of life on the Invid homeworld and returned it to his planet, where it was converted via a powerful matrix into protoculture, an extremely powerful and compact energy source. This discovery eventually gave way to cloning, militarization, and the cultural shift of Zor's people into the Robotech Masters. These masters would create the Zentradi as their slave army, who returned to the Invid planet to strip it of its priceless resources. This would in turn start a war with the Invid that would rage until this day. Regretting what he had unleashed, Zor secretly transported the original protoculture matrix within his flagship, the SDF-1, but would soon be attacked by pursuing Zentradi. Although killed, Zor managed to send the SDF-1 away, where it crashed on Earth. The humans discovered and rebuilt the vessel, learned from it, but managed to miss the matrix stowed on board. 10 years later, the Zentradi arrive. A war engulfs the solar system, but exposure to humanity eventually results in vast numbers of Zentradi turning against their masters. Although Earth is decimated by the conflict, humanity survives and embarks on an expeditionary force to the Master's homeworld, leaving the remains of the now destroyed SDF-1 and the Protoculture Matrix still on board, now buried under a bizarre set of mounds near the planet's largest remaining city. Unbeknownst to the expeditionary fleet, the Masters are already on their way to Earth, and they lead siege to the planet while the human fleet reaches the Master's homeworld, only to find them under attack by the Invid led by its male regent. The Masters spar with the forces of the Southern Cross in their obsession to find the Protoculture Matrix, even to the extent of cloning the original Zor in hopes of using him to reclaim their lost artifact. Zor, having sympathy with humanity, sacrifices himself to destroy the last Master's vessel, only for it to crash into the Matrix, dispersing the flower of life across the world, assuring that the Invid would eventually invade. Which they would, years later, led by the female regent, decimating the planet for the second time and harvesting the protoculture in an attempt to accelerate their race beyond the needs of flowers and physical limitations. Embroiled in their own conflict, the original expeditionary fleet is only able to send back the odd fleet to retake Earth, one of which results in a lone survivor who works with other residents on a crusade to convince the Invid Regis to abandon Earth before both species are wiped out. Now, that sounds awesome, especially how I worded it, but the Robotech saga is a mess of illogical decisions and unexplained plot holes, all arising from the limitations of the source material, mostly rooted in the second story, Southern Cross. As you heard earlier, Macross and Mostpedia are set on Earth. Southern Cross is set on another planet, one with 2 moons. The sprawling city of Macross at the end of the previous series magically turns into 3 mounds of dirt. 2 major characters from the first series bizarrely abandon their daughter on Earth as they leave on the expeditionary fleet. They never explain why Dana Sterling has blonde hair while her parents sported green and blue. I guess if Max had red hair, it could make sense. I assume she dyes it. Southern Cross also boasts the most jarring character design and the most truncated story, being the shortest due to the original anime being cancelled near the end of its run. I grew up with a fondness for the Master Saga, as it was the first I was exposed to thanks to those Kamiko comics. And thanks to BCTV's inane airing practices, I never got to finish the third part of the story, so I was never really connected to the new generation. In time, I did learn to appreciate the Macross saga as the greatest entry. It set the bar, one that the remaining shows would never reach. Masters was only the chapter that improved on the original design, but what remained was still quite weak. The new generation, what Mesa called the Mostpedia chapter, doesn't fare that much better, being painfully derivative and dragging through most of its middle episodes. But Macross? I rewatch Macross to this day, and I prefer the Robotech dubs despite the original Japanese versions with subtitles being available. There is a blind nostalgic love for this series, one that I am aware may be dated. In the era of faithful adaptations and direct importing, there's little room for these old artifacts from our youth. But think of that original show brought to Saturday morning cartoons in 1985. It featured several romances, including an interracial one, major characters died, and not in heroic ways, in meaningless, callous ways that stick with survivors long after other shows would have moved on. Hell, I was just beginning my downward spiral into adolescence, and I think Miria Sterling accelerated that process. It may explain my complications later in life when my first crush was an animated character. Any presumptions or expectations of where the show could go is utterly stomped in one of the most famous episodes in the history of animation.
The Zentradi forces are much too powerful for our weapons to handle. I
believe it. No! Imagine that. When you're 11 years old on Saturday morning with Smurfs on the other channel. Force of Arms should have been the climax of the series, but it was extended given the original's popularity in Japan. A controversial decision, as resolved plots were opened again, romantic triangles you thought had been resolved resparked, but Robotech reached its peak at that moment, and at no point in the subsequent 58 episodes would it recapture that level of audacious storytelling. But With 85 episodes ready, Robotech entered syndication in 1985, followed by Comico's comic line that same year. Simultaneously, Matchbox would come on board to release, unfortunately, some of the most depressing toys you will ever see. They couldn't import many of the original figures, especially the most sought-after Valkyrie transformable jet. These product lines would grace the pages of my Sears Wish book only twice before vanishing altogether. Arguably the second most popular design, the Cyclones, didn't translate well, as there was no real way to make the Cyclone transform without dismantling the entire design. As a result, they were sold as non-transformable toys. At the same time, with the sudden explosion of Robotech in North America, Harmony Gold was approached by the disreputable executives at Canon Films to produce a Robotech feature film. Macek was prohibited from using Macross characters or footage and was denied access to the Macross feature, released in Japan, Do You Remember Love, which compressed the whole of the series into a frantic 2 hours. Instead, Macek pulled footage from another anime, Megazone 23, what started as another brilliant potential translation by Macek turned into a nightmare when Canon outright rejected the film as being too talky, lacking the action they were known for. Macek frantically created a new, confused mess of a film Canon would embrace, but they would suffer financial problems and fail to advertise the film properly. Additionally, the film was marketed to children, resulting in angry parents given the violence depicted on screen. Concurrently, Macek and Harmony Gold were tasked to create a sequel to the original 85-episode run. The new series, The Sentinels, would tell the story of the expeditionary force leaving Earth after the Macross saga, returning original characters from Macross back into the light. It was the first time Robotech would see the creation of original animation. Even the comics advertised it. By the end of 1985, it appeared unlikely the project would continue despite 3 episodes already in the can. And that, like I said, happened within 2 years. In 1986, we can finally talk games. Well, obviously Macross had its own games, none of which were ever imported, let alone translated to Robotech. And despite Robotech under the threat of obscurity, it didn't stop Kevin Sambita of Palladium Books from acquiring the rights of Robotech with the intent to make a role-playing game. By that time, Palladium had only a few titles to their name, including their namesake fantasy system and an early success with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Robotech would soon emerge as a dominant title until the release much later of Rifts. Kevin Sambita was the sole writer on many of these books, starting with the core Macross rulebook and following that up with 2 more in that same generation, with Book 4 finally progressing into Southern Cross and the new generation showing up 1 book later. It should be noted, the Palladium system is, well, it's kind of junk. The damage scaling is highly inconsistent, its rules simplistic, and at our first opportunity in the 90s, we abandoned the mechanics despite loving the setting when Zorian Games released Mechton, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The Robotech movie was a debacle. The Sentinels had stalled thanks to the waning US dollar in comparison to the yen. Not only that, but Robotech had begun to be overwhelmed by a deluge of new toy-based franchises that would saturate Saturday mornings. Harmony Gold had one final chance to recover their franchise, the 1986 Toy Fair in New York. This was a seminal year, marked with a dramatic increase in mature toys, including, if you can believe it, a line of Rambo action figures. Hasbro was bringing their A-game to the convention, used to showcase and sell product lines to retailers across the continent. My Little Pony, Hasbro Softies, and G.I. Joe were hitting their stride, but Transformers had never been bigger. 1986 would be the year of the Transformers movie, and with Mattel bringing He-Man as well, and with both companies worth billions compared to Matchbox's millions, it was difficult to stand out. To make matters worse, the Robotech toys were of inferior quality and most couldn't transform. The 1986 fair proved disastrous, with Matchbox failing to sell their toys to retailers. It was then and there when Matchbox cut their ties with Harmony Gold and Robotech. Without a toy line, the future of Robotech was sealed. Carl Macek would eventually release The Sentinels as a short movie comprised of those few episodes finished, though it would take years before most fans would ever get a chance to see it. Simultaneously, local anime organizations like the Vancouver Japanese Anime Club began importing anime for distribution without adaptation, potentially rendering the bastardization of Robotech obsolete. And it got worse. 1986 was also the moment Comico Comics filed for bankruptcy. Thankfully, they had finished adapting the entirety of the Robotech franchise thanks to them publishing all 3 generations simultaneously. 1987. We still have the Palladium games, and now a new series of novels released by Del Rey. These were written by Jack McKinney, which itself was a pseudonym for American authors James Luceno and Brian Daley. If you can believe it, because I as a writer am certainly dumbfounded, Luceno and Daley were contracted to deliver the first 12 novels adapting the entirety of the original series in 12 months. 12 novels in 12 months. That same year, with assets acquired from the development of Sentinels, Palladium began diving into the expanded universe of Robotech. And that should give you a hint on where this is going. I'm not sure if there were ever any connecting threads between the novels and role-playing books, but starting with the 13th novel, Luceno and Daley began diving into Sentinels lore as well. Meanwhile, the ball dropped by Kamiko was picked up by Eternity Comics, which would later become an imprint of Malibu. They started, probably as Sambita and McKinney had, by adapting the original scripts for the Sentinels, both the produced and unproduced episodes. And if you can believe it, this is the only issue I ever acquired. Kind of sad considering the comic adaptation of Sentinels would be the longest of any series, running from 1988 to 1996, and eventually switching from Malibu to Academy Comics. Initial writer, Chris Ulm, would be later replaced with two men, Jason and John Waltrip, originally artists and also twins, that would also assume writing duties and remain so for the entirety of the Sentinels run, all the way to its final issue in 1995. In that time, they would create tangent stories, including this one issue I had, the Cyber Pirates, as well as the Malcontent Uprising, wedding specials, and, unfortunately, a swimsuit issue. Because of course they would. With Kevin Sambita, James Luceno, Brian Daley, Jason Waltrip, and John Waltrip, these five men effectively kept Robotech alive, in a time where it wasn't receiving much support from anyone else. 1987 would also mark the departure of Macek from Harmony Gold, and in 1988 formed Streamline Pictures, which infamously would continue its practice of loose adaptations. Macek would even be credited as a writer of the anime being adapted, further vilifying him within the art and anime community at the time. While emerging anime import companies were relegated to subtitles, Streamline offered dubs of early titles including Lensman, My Neighbor Totoro, and one of the seminal anime titles of all time, I credit Carl for introducing me to anime, and I imagine my adoration for the medium would not be as pronounced if it weren't for him. But I must admit, he was a controversial figure. If Twitter had existed in the 80s, Macek would have been bullied off the platform. His translations were notorious for changing names, plot points, while simultaneously taking credit as an original work. Through the late 80s, Robotech remained within the fandom solely on the backs of the still published RPGs, novels, and various emerging anime magazines like Protocol Tactics, which began production in 87 and later expanded its coverage from one series to all things anime. 1989 would prove to be another downward step for the franchise. James Luceno and Brian Daley released their final novel, well, kind of the Robotech series, The End of the Circle. Palladium was slowing down their production schedule in preparation for an upcoming original property that would soon become the defining title of Palladium's history, Rifts. Meanwhile, in Japan, the legal issues around Macross revolved around who actually owned it. Studio New was obviously credited with creating the series animated by Artland and Tatsunoko Productions, but Big West, a Japanese advertising company, was its sole sponsor. The latter would also fund the production of related titles including Superdimensional Century Orgus and Superdimensional Cavalry Southern Cross, the later produced by Tatsunoko. In 1984, all parties collaborated in the feature film Macross Do You Remember Love? As mentioned, Harmony Gold was unable to adapt the film to include it within the Robotech line, and it would later be heavily modified and imported under the title Clash of the Bionoids. The Japanese alliance would remain until after the release of Superdimensional Fortress Macross Flashback 2012 in 1987. Legal battles would ensue for years between Big West, Studio New, Tatsunoko, and Harmony Gold. Finally, in 1992, Big West, with no involvement from the original series creators of Studio New or the original series animators of Tatsunoko, would push for a sequel to the original Macross. The 90s would prove a resurgence of the original series while Robotech suffered in the shadows, a relic from a time best left forgotten. It was decided that the 10-year anniversary of the original Macross would mark the perfect occasion for the sequel. As Big West was an original sponsor of Macross, this superseded any deal Harmony Gold had regarding the property. And in 1992, Macross 2, Lovers Again, was released globally. In North America, it fell to US Renditions to handle the dub, an emerging company that had appeared in '87 and released the first subtitled direct-to-home anime. Palladium would jump into the ring as well, releasing a Macross 2 role-playing game, and yes, there were comics. Macross 2, through pure tangent association, brought Robotech back into the eyes of anime fans. Toys and models were being imported, and the sudden success sparked a renewed interest in the franchise with the original creators at Studio New. They would declare Macross 2 non-canonical, and part of a tangent timeline, and would go about creating their own follow-up to the classic series. And in 1994, that would occur with the release of one of the most legendary animated titles of all time. One could say the success of Macross Plus came about from a perfect combination of factors, not just from original creator Studio New, but also legendary anime director Shinichiro Watanabe, who would go on to direct both Cowboy Bebop and Samurai Champloo. And the celebrated composer Yoko Kanno would later define an anime generation with her work not only on Cowboy Bebop, but also Ghost in the Shell. Who needed Robotech? At the same time, Palladium released their last RPG supplement based on the original series, Book 8, Strike Force. They would not release another Robotech RPG for 14 years. It would also be the year of Studio New's second follow-up to the original Macross, though this one was not as well received. Harmony Gold would again affirm their stranglehold on the Macross property in North America, permanently preventing a translation of the new series, confusingly titled Macross 7. There were other hurdles as well, including especially complex issues regarding the music rights to the series. It ultimately wouldn't matter, as Macross 7, well, kinda sucks. Seriously, it is exceedingly goofy, but it still proved enough of a success in Japan to keep the franchise alive for the rest of the millennium. 1996. And as mentioned, by this point I'm thinking yesterday, the Sentinels comic adaptation across two companies, Eternity and Academy, written by the Waltrip brothers, finally ended when Harmony Gold rather unexpectedly revoked Academy's license. With no more comics or role-playing games, it looked like Robotech was on death watch. The obscurity of Robotech in the 90s could be directly tracked to the rise of direct imported anime. US renditions was only the first. Animigo, Manga Home Entertainment, even Pioneer would enter the game, eventually leading to Japanese companies handling their own translations in some cases. This ignored the rise of the internet and the capacity for illegal exports. Harmony Gold could no longer control the narrative regarding Robotech. But boy, they tried. That same year, FASA, remember them, was finally sued as a consequence of their own failed lawsuit against Playmates, who had a partnership with Harmony Gold. This eventually resulted in FASA finally being forced to eliminate many of the designs they had acquired from Japan, most notably the Transforming Jet. These became known as the Unseen, in-canon mechs that only returned publicly in 2015 as part of a retcon. 1997 would see a resurrection of sorts when Antarctic Press gained the license to produce their own comic series. Not only did Antarctic make the controversial decision not to bring on the Waltrips to finish their Sentinel story, but this new comic line would only last a single year, with Harmony Gold revoking their license as they had done with Academy. However, unlike Academy, the termination of the Antarctic license could be considered justified, because these comics suck. Clearly written by individuals with no respect for the acquired property. Regardless of your opinion of this series, the termination of this killed the Robotech comics for 5 years. Despite Harmony Gold doing little with the franchise, in 1988 they extended their stranglehold over Macross and its related titles until 2021. But there was a problem. Although Harmony Gold owned Robotech and were preventing sequels of Macross from being imported, they couldn't actually create their own sequels to the original Macross property. They could still follow up the two other animes adapted, resulting in the disastrous attempt to break into the computer animated television scene with Robotech 3000, produced by Netter Digital. As we have learned with Spider-Man and Fantastic Four, a company need not produce good content for it to count towards a license, and several other failed projects continued. In 2000, the video game company Vicious Cycle was formed, and their opening release emerged in 2001, Robotech Battle Cry. Surprisingly, this title would follow the events of the Macross saga, though centered around an original character. Despite earning average reviews, it would soon achieve cult status given its connection to the franchise. It was really good, superior to many of the Japanese games we would never see. It enlisted original voice actors and featured a transforming Robotech. Yes, I owned it. Yes, I played it. And yes, it was that good. In Japan, in 2002, the blight of Macross 7 would finally make room for a far superior and once again confusingly titled Macross Zero, this time marking the 20th anniversary of the original Macross. Zero is strikingly good looking, and thankfully fan subs do exist, because once again, Harmony Gold has prevented its legal release outside of Japan. 2002 would also see the release of a new Robotech tabletop game? There's no discussion, only 2 ratings, and the only image was this frame. It's an unofficial homebrew title, but outside of Palladium, this was all we had. 2002 would also mark the return of Robotech in comic form. Wildstorm, an imprint of DC Comics, would handle the franchise for 8 years. Instead of running a singular series, Wildstorm released a variety of limited run stories, not unlike what Dark Horse was famous for with Alien and Predator. However, this also marked Harmony Gold's attempt to reboot the franchise with revised stories that deviated from the original timeline. This included From the Stars, Love and War, Invasion, and Prelude to Shadow Chronicles, the latter bringing back Jason and John Waltrip to finish and somewhat retcon their original Sentinel story, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. In 2004, Vicious Cycle would return, this time focusing around the Invid invasion. It shifted from a Robotech to a Cyclone, and from a third-person to a first-person perspective, though the latter could be adjusted. I own this game as well. However, Robotech Invasion wasn't a popular title and became a disappointment, resulting in no further video games being published with the Robotech label. Ever. Palladium wasn't doing much better either. The rise of 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons and its open gaming license resulted in a massive shift of popularity back to the once diminishing franchise. Any game not employing these mechanics would suffer a significant sales drop. 2004 would also mark the biggest change-up in Robotech since 1986. Harmony Gold, already notorious for their legal issues and lack of actual content, announced a successor to the original series, Shadow Force, which would later be renamed Shadow Chronicles. Although Tatsunoko was involved in the production, most of the computer-assisted animation fell to Korean studio DR Movie. Shadow Chronicles looked promising, taking place immediately after the events of the last episode of Invid Invasion. Yes, I've done this several times. New Generation and Invid Invasion are the same thing. Around the same time, we had our first official Robotech tabletop game, and it was a collectible card game. This wasn't well received. This would be publisher Hero Games Factory's only title, and they would go belly up shortly after. Meanwhile, Harmony Gold, in the lead-up to Shadow Chronicles, declared the only aspect of Robotech canonical was the original 85-episode run. That's right. Just like with Disney and Star Wars, the entirety of the Robotech extended universe, including the Sentinels, was kicked out of the franchise. The comics, non-canonical. The games, all gone. A small price to pay for a resurgence of Robotech, and one as good-looking as this one. Just too bad it wouldn't last. Shadow Chronicles was well received and found limited convention screenings before finally reaching mass distribution via Funimation in 2007, where it sold considerably well. Around that same time, Harmony Gold announced plans for a sequel, Robotech Shadow Rising. As you might have figured out, this never happened. There were 2 factors. First, the resurging interest in the franchise resulted in talks with Warner Bros. To develop a live-action feature film, which would remain in development hell to this very day. However, this was a minor concern. The agreement between Harmony Gold and Funimation was terminated in 2007 due to creative differences. This was simultaneous with the collapse of the global anime market in around that same time. It came about thanks to the rise of internet distribution and the outmoded ways current importers were distributing their anime. To put it simply, you could purchase an entire season of The Simpsons for $30, but that same price would only net you 4 episodes of a Japanese import. Eventually fans had had enough, and sales across North America plummeted. It didn't matter. This rebooted Robotech died in the crib, and the Shadow Rising trademark was abandoned, which means that yes, technically, it's no longer considered canon. 2008. And would you believe it, Palladium finally returns to Robotech with the official Shadow Chronicles role-playing game. Little late to the party, guys. As Robotech was sinking for a second time, Macross found another hit with Macross Frontier, this time with a full 25-episode series. One that once again would not find distribution outside of Japan thanks to Harmony Gold's stranglehold. Fortunately, as mentioned, unofficial subtitled versions do exist. 2010. And the great bird of Robotech, Carl Macek, arguably one of the most influential and controversial figures relating to Japanese animation in North America, and considered by many to have been instrumental in raising the awareness of the medium in a time where few other imports existed, died of a heart attack at the age of 58. While hated by some, many people, including myself, consider Macek to be the most influential man in animation that never worked for Disney or Warner Brothers. (2013). For many, 2013 would be a controversial one. Harmony Gold would release Love, Live, Alive, a direct-to-video animated film based on the 1985 Japanese OVA music video Genesis Clamor Mospeda, Love, Live, Alive, and yes, that's right, the imported 28-year-old anime. Harmony Gold would also stretch the legal muscles again by suing Hasbro upon the release of a new Jetfire. It was dismissed with prejudice. Harmony Gold could no longer sue Hasbro over the rights of the transforming jet. In July of that year, Dynamite, an imprint of DC, announced a new series of Robotech comics, though these were short-lived. Most of the planned stories were scrubbed, and the only one to reach print was, and you're all gonna love this, a Robotech Voltron crossover. I'll just leave it at that. With this failure, we wouldn't see a Robotech comic until 2017. 2013 would also be the year of Palladium's return to Robotech gaming. That did not go well. Tabletop had exploded onto the scene. Kickstarter was soon becoming the weapon of choice for numerous emerging game designers. 2013 was the year the crowdfunding platform reached Canada. Oh yeah, it was also the year of my first Kickstarter. Robotech RPG Tactics sought to replicate the tabletop miniature craze dominated by Warhammer and War Machine, and the campaign certainly did well, raising $1.4 million over the length of its campaign, breaking through nearly every stretch goal. It's unsure how much more money was raised after the campaign, but apparently it still wasn't enough. Palladium was struck by initial issues regarding the production of miniatures, entering in a collaboration with Ninja Division, a partnership that would prove disastrous. Ninja Division had already established a reputation with miniature design, though it would be revealed later that they suffered through considerable infrastructure deficiencies. For one, the 3D sculpts of the models, which cost $35,000, were incompatible with Ninja Division's production process. Cost overruns resulted in the Kickstarter money running dry. Palladium scrambled for outside investment, which never materialized. To put it into hard numbers, despite raising over $1 million, they required another $625,000 to complete their obligations. Although many backers received their first wave, the core box, the second wave never materialized. In a desperate attempt to increase revenue, many copies of the core game, despite still not arriving at backers' doorsteps, were sold through retail. It wasn't enough. Out of money, Robotech RPG Tactics collapsed. The backer community responded respectfully. No! He understandably went ballistic, culminating in game designer Carmen Belair attempting suicide. Kevin Simbita laid the cause of the attempt directly on the abuse Belair received from backers. Yeah, that didn't go down well. It only antagonized backers more, accusing Simbita of using Belair's despair to deflect attention from his own failings. The last post in the campaign was on May 7th, 2018. Palladium's partner Ninja Division would suffer an even worse fate. Even though they were initially spared much of the blowback from Robotech RPG Tactics' failure, they would suffer numerous problems with their own campaigns, up to and including a disastrous campaign relating to the Starfinder role-playing game, which would see Ninja Division being removed from the project by Paizo and handed to another developer. Months later, many experts believed it was Ninja Division that destroyed any chances of Robotech's success, and Palladium was a hapless victim, a belief that could have been propagated if Kevin Simbita knew how to handle customer assistance. You think, considering the intent of this video was to cover the entire history of Robotech gaming, that I would have to acquire Robotech RPG Tactics and review it. But as you can imagine, obtaining a copy would be next to impossible. Let's do this. Wow, these are crazy small sprues. You guys cannot expect me to paint these. No, I'll build them. Obviously, I have to build them, but no, I am not gonna paint these. No. Firstly, let's make it clear that this is a miniature combat game, not a board game. So, like similar games like War Machine and Warhammer, you measure distance in inches with a ruler or tape measure rather than squares or hexes. There are only two sides, well, obviously, RDF and Centrati, and thanks to that non-existent second wave, we only have access to a handful of different mechs. A model's abilities are represented by speed, piloting, gunnery, and defense. Weapons also list range and damage values. Like with war games and tactics, each side builds an equal-sized force by spending points. And yes, this is an equal-sized encounter. Which direction a model faces is critical, as it determines which weapons can fire, as well as calculating the level of armor that can defend against an incoming attack. After an army is formed, each side collects their matching dice and command tokens. These are gained based on any leadership values listed on named commanders, as well as on the number of models currently on the battlefield. In this case, the Zentradi player gains 6, the RDF player gains 3. Command points can be spent to steal an activation from your opponent or allow your models to shoot down missiles or roll to reduce incoming damage. However, they are most often used to take additional actions. Spend 1 to take an extra move based on your model's ability. You can also spend a command point to attack with an additional weapon that model possesses, be it a second firearm or another melee attack. In the case of the Veritech GU11 gun pod, it can make an additional attack with the same weapon by spending a command point. A turn begins with each player gaining command points for that turn. Points from previous turns are lost, and each player rolls 2d6 to determine initiative, with the winner determining which of the two players takes their first activation. That leads to the action phase, where each player takes turns activating an entire squadron. Said squad can move and or fire one or more weapons, though it must be in this order, meaning you can't fire a weapon and then move. You measure your movement via the middle of the model, acknowledging any terrain that can impede you. One aspect of tactics I love is the permission to measure any distances on the board, unlike Warhammer, where you have to eyeball it before committing. When making an attack, select one model, one opponent, verify range, roll a die, and add one's gunnery skill and see if it meets or supersedes that opponent's defense value. Cover, backstrikes, and close formation can alter these values. If a missile, and if the opponent possesses an anti-missile system, like all Regal battle pods have, the opponent may spend a command point to roll a d6. On a roll of 5 or 6, the missile is shot down. Otherwise, the opponent may also attempt to spend a command point and dodge. Roll a d6, add your piloting skill, and see if it equals or supersedes the attack roll. If so, the attack misses. Even if attack misses, you can still spend a command point to roll to reduce the incoming damage by half. Each unit has a listed mega damage rating, which in this case, of the Regalt, is 5. The average Veritech starts at 14. Outside of these simple rules, each model can feature numerous special rules, not the least of which includes the Veritech's capacity to transform. During the activation, you can select a new form for a Veritech, replacing the model with a new form. Other abilities include being able to fire 4 missiles at once, various hand-to-hand options, and being able to attack behind you. Depending on the weapon, you may need to track ammunition. If in jet mode, you must move a minimum distance on your turn. Despite the book listing dozens of different models, the game is limited to only 7. Veritechs, Regalt battle pods, Quell Regalt reconnaissance pods, a single Glog officer pod, a single Quell Gulnau support pod, 2 Raider X's and 2 Gladiators. I meant to say 2 Spartans and 2 Defenders. Each of these models you can upgrade with officer options, but with the Veritechs, the number of varieties is vast. You can insert Max or Myria, and yes, technically this paint scheme on Myria is not accurate. You can even play as Ben Dixon. Not sure why, but he's an option. Alas, a number of alternative options are not available thanks to the Kickstarter collapse, including the Super Veritech, Armored Veritechs, the Mach 2 Monsters. Even more tragic is the lack of the Quadloon Raw power armor. Thankfully, an option has recently emerged. In 2019, Minitech started producing single-piece Robotech miniatures, including the monster, both male and females in Zentradi power armors, as well as the armored and Super Veritechs. I certainly love the idea of not assembling miniatures, but it should be noted that the Minitech minis don't match the scale of those in the Tactics box. They're close. They also lack the large base required for accurately measuring range, distance, and location, so you may need to find additional large bases or fabricate your own. Minitech also released a line of Robotech statues, including a series of Veritech busts, a 1/4 scale Cyclone, and the Piece de Resistance, a 1200 scale fully illuminated SDF-1 Macross. It will be mine. Oh yes, it will be mine. Technically, Palladium did release expansion boxes, including additional Veritech battle pods, and one was released featuring the unseen Spartan and Phalanxes, not found in the basic box, though good luck trying to locate one now. Now let's ignore the controversy and look at Robotech RPG Tactics impartially, which I can attempt as I was not one of those unlucky people who got fleeced by the campaign. Constructing the models was exceedingly annoying. A single Battloid, which only measures 2 inches in height, is comprised of a mind-boggling 17 parts. And with these Veritechs trying to match the upper and lower arms in both Battloid and Gurwalk was a nightmare. I started cutting the parts just to force a piece to work. The missiles were a pain, and don't get me started on their heads. The battle pods were thankfully easier, but painting 12 identical models certainly wasn't what I would call a fun weekend. And about that, in the basic box, the RDF player enjoys 2 Destroids which can be custom painted and 6 Veritechs that can all be customized. The Centrati has 1 officer pod, 1 support pod, that 1 reconnaissance pod, and 12 identical battle pods, making the enjoyment factor of the Centrati player limited if sticking exclusively with the core box. The RDF player can transform planes, lay down missile fire. The Centrati player moves and shoots. As for the rules themselves, these aren't bad. Of course, the book was written from the perspective of wargaming and not board games, so the game lacks reference cards or easily laid out rules. But combat itself is good. The command points are a cool idea, and I appreciate the familiar rules any tabletop wargamer will recognize, though I will state in the few games I did play that it felt like the die rolling skewed the result of combat more than actual tactics. So that's it. Robotech RPG Tactics. I'll give it a 6 out of 10. This is Chris from DSX. Wait. I'm not done yet. The ultimate casualty of the Robotech RPG Tactics debacle was that in 2018, after over 30 years with the Robotech franchise, Palladium lost its license. In 2014, with the Palladium campaign still on the verge of disintegrating, Harmony Gold attempted the Kickstarter route themselves. This was Robotech Academy, and if you can believe it, Harmony Gold said it during the Sentinels. Their campaign asked for $661,000, but was cancelled at $276,000 after it was clear the project would not fund. Despite promises that the project wasn't dead, nothing has progressed on this front. It appeared clear that any attempt to bring Robotech back to the mainstream was fated to fail. In 2016, back in Japan, following up Macross Frontier, Delta was another full season of Macross. It was not as well received as the others, and as you probably predicted by now, has never seen an international release thanks to Harmony Gold's stranglehold on the property. Those live action films? Still pending. The Palladium license? Gone. Robotech Academy? Non-existent. The franchise wasn't going down without a fight. 2017. As we've been denied a Robotech or Macross video game in North America for over 15 years by this point, I hope we haven't been missing out on any exports from Japan. Okay, maybe a few. That same year would find Robotech's return to physical media under Titan Comics. This started with a rebooted Robotech working off a new timeline which heavily deviated from the events of the original series. For example, Captain Global dies during the SDF-1's initial transformation, replaced by Lisa Hayes. Ben Dixon dies during the escape from the Centrati in issue 12 instead of much later, and the comics introduced a clone of Roy Fokker, and I am not making that up. By the end of its run, the timeline had properly skewed to become virtually unrecognizable. Did that gamble pay off? Depends on who you ask. The first series ran for 20 issues and was later succeeded by Robotech Event Horizon and Robotech Remix. Their last issue was released on January of 2020. In 2018, Harmony Gold finally licensed Robotech to a pair of new game developers, and we finally come to this. Quite the number of titles in only 2 years. Solar Flare Games released 2 of them, first with Robotech Force of Arms and later with Robotech Crisis Point. By the way, don't bother searching for them on Google because the first result takes you to... Best you just enter solarflaregames.com. Force of Arms is a small box 2-player combat card game with a setup involving the layout of this 3x3 grid with the empty space in the center. Each player takes a deck of color-coded cards, red for RDF, green for Centrati. 2 sides of this grid are reserved for each character. On a turn, a player picks one of their ships and swaps its location with any other card. Then you place 2 of your fighter cards along the outside border you control, adjacent to one of the 9 central cards. You can place up to 2 in each row. Cards are placed face down unless they grant a special ability, like combat tokens, which are set aside when earned. After each player has played his or her cards, any earned tokens, which can adjust combat values, can be placed. Pick 1 token and place it on one of the 3x3 cards in the center. Then each player then picks up their 4 command cards and 4 hero cards. Play alternates until each side has played 1 hero and 2 command cards, which can alter the effects of the layout. Then point scoring can begin. With each of the 8 ship cards in the center, the attacker adds the combat value of the cards vertically and horizontally to that card. The defender then adds up defense values, including the one listed on the card. If the attacker's is higher, that player gains the card and the points on it. Otherwise, the defender claims the card and the points. This continues for all 8 cards, and a winner is determined. Force of Arms is a thin game, both thematically and mechanically. The rules are separate from the Robotech label, but at such a cheap price point, one can't really complain. Actually, I can. This is not a great game. The issue stems from overt randomness, with most cards being played face down, and with the flipping of cards in the row, it's a crapshoot on who wins which card. A victory feels bland and hollow, like winning at Monopoly. Do you really feel good about it? I mean, a game of Force of Arms takes like 10 minutes, and after you play it, you can sure swap the sides and try again, but there's little to no replayability. Once you played the game once or twice, the novelty completely wears off. I'll give Force of Arms a 4 out of 10. Maybe their second offering will be better. Robotech Crisis Point is refreshingly set during the Robotech Master Story. This is a 2-player combat card game that... Okay. Lay out the board, each player gains their decks of cards, combat, unit, command, hero, and secret objectives. There's also 1 base. Each player then gains 4 random location cards. 2 objectives are selected. On a player's turn during the tactics phase, pick a unit, strategic location, or base, and place it anywhere on the combat grid, clicking battle tokens if listed, or playing out specific rules on the card. You must then play at least one of these tokens on a card within this grid. You then also play one of your combat cards along the 2 sides you control. Face down with a maximum of 1 card in each spot. This continues until the battlefield is filled. After which, we have, as you might have guessed it, the token phase where any remaining modifier tokens are placed. And then we have, wait for it, the hero and command phase where each player will play a total of 2 hero cards and 2 command cards. There aren't any defense or attack values here. Add up the combat value from the connected cards vertically and horizontally for each card in the battlefield. The higher combat value wins the card, and whatever points are on it. Yes, this is effectively the same game. Only a few rules have been switched out. More cards have been added. But did these changes fix an already thin and random game? No, they did not. While the scale of the game has increased and the number of options as a result, the game will still reveal all its secrets within 2 plays, and you'll quickly grow bored. Playing cards face down once again makes strategy extremely difficult, with the winner feeling owed to luck more than skill. Crisis Point is a better game, I will admit, but it does not fix core issues borrowed from the smaller Force of Arms. I'll give it a 5 out of 10. Not a good start. So I say, Solar Flare's entries have a lot to be desired. After Crisis Point's release, Solar Flare went silent for a while. I thought they were done, but recently they've begun promoting their 3rd Robotech title, the Invid Invasion set game called Invid Invasion. This is a game where players lay down cards in a grid. Okay. Okay, well, thankfully this is a cooperative game instead of a competitive 1 versus 1 combat game, and the time of this video's posting has yet to be released. From the looks, it involves laying down random Invid cards face down and trying to get the good guys across the board to a fixed point. This thankfully looks like a much better game than the previous two, and I'm looking forward to playing it. This leads us to Strange Machine and Japanime Games and a slew of Robotech titles including Brace for Impact, Attack on the SDF-1, Cyclone Run, and Ace Pilot. They also produced the first new role-playing game since Palladium lost the license. Wait, that's not the game. That's the game. Yes, if you can believe it, there are 2 Robotech role-playing games. Battlefield Press released their Savage World adaptation only 5 months before Strange Machine released theirs, both in 2019. Currently, the Battlefield Press edition is selling better, despite the Strange Machine version being better received. As for the board games, let's start small. Ace Pilot, which is a 2 to 4 player dice game set in the Macross timeline. Lay out this 3x3 stack of Zentradi units and the 8 hero action cards. On a player's turn, roll the dice with up to 2 allowed rerolls. Spend them to activate any of the hero cards and inflict damage upon the indicated stacks. When you activate a hero, it is flipped over, meaning fewer options for the second player. Killed units are claimed as points for the end of the game. After both players have played their turn, the order flips with the second player going first, and so on. There are also 8 upgrade tokens mixed with the stacks, which can gain you an ability card. The height of the stacks is based on player count. This is honestly kind of fun. I mean, it's as thin on theme as the Solar Floor offerings, but it's just better. I don't know what to say. It's like I like chucking dice. It's a simple game and it's inexpensive. I'll give it a 6 out of 10. Not a bad start. Let's look at Cyclone Run. This is a 2 to 4 player dice game set in the Invid timeline. Lay out this 3x3 stack of Invid units, as well as the 9 hero action cards. On a player's turn, roll dice with up to 2 allowed rolls, and are you kidding me? I just don't know. I don't know. Like, wow. Like, seriously? Like, I don't believe it. It's the same game. Like with Solar Flare, Strange Machine is taking near identical games, flipping their theme to another entry in the Robotech saga. Okay, so following a pattern, is it safe to say that Cyclone Run is a better game for learning from the shortcomings of the previous title? Well, yes. Enemy titles are face down. Place these 2 wooden meeples representing Lunk's truck and Scott's bike. Activated heroes can now reveal enemies, and said enemies are killed by moving the wooden meeples over them. All other rules apply: paying for dice, flipping over cards, nice touch with Lancer turning into Yellow Dancer, gaining upgrade cards, and the acquiring of points. Cyclone Run is a better game. I certainly like the improvements on this, which is admittedly still a thin game. It's ironic that the less popular series, Masters and Invid Invasion, are the better games. I'll give Cyclone Run a 7 out of 10, but we're still not done. Leading us to Robotech Brace for Impact. And this one is weird. No way dancing around this. Robotech Brace for Impact is a party game? It features all the hallmarks of a party game. The player count goes to 15, there are sand timers, and actions occur simultaneously. A single Zentradi player either plays the topmost event card or discards it in favor of a Zentradi attack. An event can place any number of these cards across this octagon. Wait, no, I'd rather not get a copyright strike, thank you. The octagon of spots represents the SDF-1 with all these tokens representing the damage each system can take. The Zentradi places cards in any open space. If discarding, the player may do an attack, where you flick the spinner. Where it lands determines the damage inflicted. Flip the card for an attack or damage the exposed system. In real time, the RDF players are trying to repair systems. No joke, the Zentradi player acts when the green 30-second timer runs out. The Zentradi player then activates and then flips the timer to wait the next turn. Meanwhile, other players are drawing a number of cards based on the functioning life support. One character must shout a command listed on a card in hand. That card is then placed face up with a maximum of 1 per player. Another player must respond with a matching card to activate that action. If committing an attack, select the Zentradi card, flick the spinner, add in the attack values. If higher, the player destroys the enemy. Other actions include repairing the various systems or revealing the hidden cards, some of which may actually be allies. When a ship is attacked, the ability on its back can activate, including the adding of more cards to each player's hand or the repairing of systems. But when cards in hand are nearly exhausted, an RDF player may exclaim, "Brace for impact!" No, really, you have to shout this. And everyone can add cards to their hand equal to the current life support value. Alas, the Zentradi player also gets a turn. The game is won by the Centrati player if the reflex furnace is breached, and when it does, activates its own 60-second timer that ends the game if not fixed in time. The hull is destroyed, or if a card is added to the octagon and all spots are full. The RDF team wins if a reflex cannon timer completes 2 cycles with the main gun firing when flipped, and the Centrati player fails to beat the players. Yes, that means no matter what, a game of Brace for Impact will last 10 minutes. The game also lists a bunch of options with enemy commanders and variant enemy tactics cards. You would think this game would be limited to 3 or more players, but there is a fully co-op variant for groups of 4 players or less. This variant does away with the enemy commander cards, the event cards, the tactic cards, most of the cards in the RDF deck, and the real-time element. Players draw however many cards they wish and attempt to defeat a non-existent player. And if you have not figured out yet, this is a rather hollow experience. Nearly half the game is removed for the co-op variant, with any urgency disconnected. The co-op experience gets a best of 5 out of 10, though the party size real-time element is much, much better, getting a 7 out of 10 from me. So far, these games all feature somewhat mediocre production value, hard to read rules, simple mechanics, and fast gameplay, though fast does not always mean fun. Like I said, in every instance, I struggled with the rules, especially with Brace for Impact and Crisis Point. I don't need miniatures with my game, but there's still a noted level of repetition with graphical elements across all of these games. The biggest issue with all of these, however, is their slapped-on theme. You could swap out any of the images without shifting gameplay, and let's be honest, the repeating rules I could do without. You certainly don't need both dice games and both card games, and like I said 681 words prior, it's ironic that the better saga, Macross, is saddled with the weaker games. Ultimately, all these titles, regardless of actual enjoyment, lack thematic cohesion. I'll likely not keep Solar Flare games, and with the superior Cyclone run, I'm unlikely to keep Ace Pilot either. Which finally brings us to the largest game of them all. Robotech Attack on the SDF-1, a 2+ hour, 5-player cooperative game. And to be honest, by this point, Stray Machine Games, or SMG, will need to pull something interesting out of their hat in order to redeem this modern line of Robotech games. Okay, no, seriously, you have to build this thing, which you won't dismantle and will place proudly somewhere to boast your acquisition. Is it a good game? Well, sometimes my opinions can get muddled in my presentation, so let me say it directly. Robotech Attack on the SDF-1 is the best cooperative game I have played ever. Yeah, I said it. Suck it, pandemic. Right out of the gate, this game gets a 10 out of 10. And yeah, admittedly, yes, graphical elements are borrowed, the manual isn't great, and the gameplay will remind some people of Castle Panic. Players assume the roles of characters from Macross that are initially assigned to locations across the SDF-1. Except for pilots, they'll remain on the ship. For the rest, they're going to be heading out to deal with the threats directly. Like Castle Panic, you're trying to defeat enemies before they get too close and damage one of the many systems, eventually potentially destroying the ship and losing the game. Characters are asymmetric with vastly different abilities and special actions. Only Captain Global can transform the ship. Only Liesel Hayes can do the Daedalus maneuver. Each of the pilots operate differently. There's a campaign book with connected missions based on episodes of the show. Abilities and upgrades carry over. This game is amazing. Which kind of pisses me off. I mean, seriously, if SMG had this masterpiece on their menu, why would you order anything else? We need more titles like this. Whatever, let's get into it. Unfold the map, place the SDF-1, and have players select characters. Based on the mission selected, you'll start with a maximum limit on deployable mechs, with a few already positioned. Set the tokens across the danger board based on the mission, likely 7 for population. The game is balanced for 4 to 5 characters, so if playing with less than 4, you'll need to play extra characters, which we do anyway. At the beginning of a turn, a reveal Centrati card details the enemy forces to deploy and where, as well as any initial damage to the vessel. Based on where the population is set, you can deploy characters across this hero action section. When placed, a character is given a number of action tokens based on their location on this population board. So with this population, we can place the characters as so, leading to a number of tokens a character receives. They always receive 1. Characters act in order, spending tokens to complete actions listed on their board. You can fire the SDF-1 weapons, activate a single Destroyer or Veritech, which involves the drawing of order cards, or moving across the board in order to complete different actions or unique ones in each section. One of these involves the transformation and deployment of the SDF-1 reflex cannon. During all of this, the characters are also repairing damage, reducing reflex heat, and completing objectives, which entail the reward of these RDF tokens, which can be spent by any character to activate an especially powerful ability. Each game session involves playing through one of the episode books, and it's unfortunate there are only 3 included, though the last is replayable with unique events each time. I love the little touches here. Miria being deployed as a villain unless you select Max and activate a specific event, which turns her into an ally. The episodes match events of those in the show. And my personal favorite, the inclusion of Lin Min-mei as a detrimental negative effect you need to resolve and remove. I've often criticized cooperative games as being overly difficult in order to appease the vocal minority, insisting on incredibly intractable games. So I'm happy to report that Attack on the SDF-1 is winnable, even on your first attempt. The game eases you into more complex ideas through a series of tutorial missions. After a successful session, you can carry your upgrades onto the next game. Characters are unique, and it's a somewhat rare occurrence when a player feels emboldened rather than crippled. A communal action pool allows for real cooperation. Yes, the graphical elements are still carried over from the other games, but here I don't mind it as much. This is a Robotech game, and one I've been waiting for. Complex mechanics and thematically consistent. And my only real disappointment is its lack of exposure. To all those Robotech fans out there, this is the board game you've been waiting for. Of course, what people probably want is another attempt at a miniature game, but one done by a proven publisher with a reputation for success, and the infrastructure to supply the miniatures on time and on budget. All these games, released between 2018 and 2019, are a great aperitif, a start of a hopeful rising trend. I want Attack on the SDF-1 to be the hallmark of a trend, not the outlier. I want more Robotech like this, especially before some metaphysical clock runs out. Not like that will be a problem. Not anymore. In 2019, Harmony Gold, with their 2021 deadline looming, was able to extend their dominion over the Robotech name and the Macross franchise, the fist still firmly clenched. But at least this franchise retains some measure of a foundation. At this point, you're probably thinking, there have been way more Macross video games than Robotech video games. Certainly, given the slew of recent Robotech board games, there would be Macross-themed board games as well. Honestly, no. Back in 1983, after the release of the original Macross, we had a few. Macross Dogfight, City Fight, and Spacefold were all released that same year. Macross VF1 Valkyrie was released the following year. There's virtually no information from Macross Love is Passing Away, though it clearly looks almost as old as the others. As for Most Peta, it had a board game in 1984 as well, called Genesis Climber Most Peta. But after that, nothing. At least that I could find. Nothing for nearly 40 years. Finally, it's come down to this. Is Robotech dead? Maybe. I know that's not decisive, but regardless of its current state or fate, it shouldn't. What's interesting is that what you're hearing now is an amendment. I originally wrote that, yes, Robotech is dead. But as I played the games, as I set up the recording, grabbed the clips, I started to feel a lump in my throat. I mean, I cried cutting in Foker's death. I was shattered when I remembered Lisa Hayes watched helplessly as her dad died on a monitor. And this is Rick Hunter, not Hikaru Ichio. The original Macross story was strong. Macross 2 was decent, but non-canonical. Macross Plus is still considered one of the greatest shows in the history of anime, but ignoring the lack of translation, further Macross sequels have failed to resonate given a strange aloofness with their writing. Plus, later narrative decisions appear to disregard the emotional investment made in the characters of the original. In Macross, the main characters that would be Rick Hunter, Lisa Hayes, and Lin Min-mei leave Earth on an expedition not unlike their Robotech counterparts, but subsequently and rather arbitrarily vanish, and they're never seen again. Ever. Max and Miria become estranged, with later shows vague on if they ever reconnect. For bizarre reasons, the Centrati are retconned to have pointed elf-like ears, which is incredibly stupid as it introduces logical plot holes given events in the first series. The later series each introduce a new alien menace disconnected with any of the previous ones. Most everyone, even those from Japan, believe the Master Saga is superior to the original Southern Cross. I'll even go so far as to claim that Invid Invasion is superior to most Peta. And taken in its entirety, Robotech is superior to Macross only because Robotech's story, after the events of the original series, took its franchise in a better direction. Superdimensional Fortress Macross is superior to the Macross saga of Robotech, but nearly 40 years of progression has shown in retrospect that Robotech built a stronger foundation. Now that could be expected, as technically Robotech's 85 episodes and subsequent media was larger than Macross, at least until recently. The problem obviously stems with Harmony Gold. And yes, water is wet. Harmony Gold continues to refuse to release their franchise while simultaneously being unable to either properly market it or create new stories. Consider this. Back in '85, Battletech was clearly inferior to Robotech. Most of its art assets were ripped off, and those that remained looked, well, dumb. The setting was highly unoriginal. After FASA closed its doors in 2000, the rights were picked up by WizKids, and in 40 years, the franchise has risen through novels and games to cast a significant shadow over the company they lost their lawsuit to. Decades later, where Robotech has managed 2 video games and a handful of board games, the Battletech franchise has launched over 30 video games. We've already seen 6 Transformers movies, and despite the popularity of giant robot movies like those and Pacific Rim, and the rise of available visual effects technology, no one can seem to gather the resources and talent to make a live-action Robotech film a reality. Robotech's failure ultimately has nothing to do with the legitimacy of its story and has everything to do with those sitting on its intellectual property. There's a part of me that wants Robotech to die, just so people with money can make something with Macross. But what I would really want is for someone to buy Robotech from Harmony Gold, who are at this point the creative equivalent of patent trolls, who are both unwilling and unable to do anything worthwhile with their franchise. Robotech deserves better, in every respect. We need more video games, more board games, more comics.